Okay, so today we are going to do a couple of things. We are going to talk about making a split 45-degree diamond. I had a project in mind that we were going to use that for, and in the process of making the sample, I realized that if you had never made a 45-degree diamond before, or had never done Quilt-as-you-go before, that project would be a little bit confusing for both of those techniques, and I didn't want anybody to go, I'm not gonna do that. So what I decided to do was show you two different projects and tips for both, because if I felt like if I split it up and showed you how to make a 45-degree split diamond on its own, and then I showed you some tips for Quilt-as-you-go, for the Quilt-as-you-go bath mat, then I think it would make more sense, because in my mind it made more sense to understand how the diamond went together without the added pressure of the Quilt-as-you-go part. Okay, that and flinging this this bath mat around trying to do the Quilt-as-you-go was not, my shoulder was not keen. So I have it most of the way put together, and we're gonna talk about some other things, and we're still gonna end up with a quilted bath mat. Okay, I just don't want anybody to go, no. So if you have questions, you can pop them in there. Rebecca is downstairs cutting web orders, so I am going to do my best to pay attention to what is happening on the laptop right there. If I don't answer your question, we'll circle back to them at the end when we're talking about the products. Okay, so if you have questions, hang on to them. What we are going to make essentially is this. So this is 2/3 of a placemat. We're going to do the third section of the placemat and sew it onto here, so then you'll see the whole placemat. If you've never made a 45-degree diamond, they can be a little crazy making. But the tool I'm going to show you makes it simpler, and I'm going to show you some tricks for lining everything up so that you get a very pleasing straight seam like that. Okay, so the tool that we're talking about today is the Creative Grids 45-degree diamond dimensions ruler. I know this looks like trig.
Looks like a giant sidekick.
It's a little like a sidekick ruler with a more extreme point. So a sidekick ruler has a 60-degree triangle. This is more like this is a 45-degree angle, and it's not, I mean, it's only a triangle from here to here, from here up, and then you use the other side for other things. So yeah, the sidekick ruler is basically this, but a 60-degree diamond instead. So 45-degree diamonds are a little bit more extreme. So that's how you get this really sharp diamond. It's sort of an elongated diamond. Okay. So there's some cool lines and points to this ruler. Also, outside of making the diamond, which you'll notice isn't even pictured here, you can also do all of these shapes as well. Well, actually, that's not true. This right here, see that little diamond in there that makes that star? That element right there is what we're going to make. So if you took all of those diamonds and you sewed them together in a circle, you end up with this, which is pretty cool. Okay, so I'm going to show you two different ways that you use this ruler to get to the same place. The first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to cut this element here. So a couple of things to pay attention to on this ruler. Let me put this on a solid thing so you can see all the lines. You can see that there's a full diamond here. Diamond has a whole bunch of lines on it. So there's a diamond that splits the middle to make two triangles. So this would be a 45-degree angle up here. Okay. Or there is a line here that splits it down the center. That makes this a 120-degree triangle angle here. Okay. Since we're using this to make a split diamond, since we're going to make this shape, what we're going to do is we're going to sew two pieces of fabric together first. Based on the pattern that I'm starting with, I have already cut my strip set. So the first step that you're going to do if you're going to make this split diamond piece is to sew a tube. So I have 2 pieces of fabric that I have sewn a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides. So there's a 1/4 inch seam on both sides. Then if I have my ruler, this is a Creative Grids ruler, so there's grippies around the edge and there's some little dot grippies. The cool part is there is also grippies down this space here, as well as this space here. The reason for that is sometimes you're going to use this ruler and the grippy is only going to be on the edge of fabric, like right now. So the solid lines that you want to pay attention to is this solid line that's running right down the middle of the diamond. Okay, for now, this is the only solid line we care about. Since I've already sewn this tube, I want to take that solid line and I want to line it up with the seam line I've stitched. So you shouldn't be able to see thread. It should be under that solid line. I'm going to slide the end of my ruler over so that it's on fabric, because I'm going to want to cut this way. So I'm going to line this up. And I want to make sure that the end of my ruler is on fabric. So when I cut this off, that's gone. Now, a lot of times when you're using a ruler like this, you're going to cut it and flip it and cut it and flip it. In this case, since this is the side that we want to cut both sides of our triangle with, I'm going to move the ruler and I'm going to flip the fabric. Then I'm going to take the same line and I'm going to line it up with this. This is why we sew a seam on both sides, because now that I've flipped it, I'm going to use that solid line and I'm going to line it up on that stitch, or that 1/4 inch seam allowance that I made. I want to cut, for this particular measurement, I want my measurement to be 4 3/4. That's just because that's the size of the strips that I cut. So I want to take this 4 3/4 line and slide it over to the edge of where I just cut it. This is one of those rulers that you want to take your time and make sure that both sides are lined up. If they're not both lined up, you're not going to be happy because your angles are going to be wonky. So I'm going to zhuzh this over a little bit so that my bottom one is lined up, and then I'm going to double check and make sure that my top one is lined up, and we're just going to do, all of the zhuzhing here, okay? Then I'm going to cut the other side of my diamond. Oh, of course, I need a new blade. Okay. Work with me. Now, what I have, when I open this up, is that diamond. Now, a couple of tips when you're working with things like this. The other reason I really like doing this technique is because when I sewed this, my strips were cut from selvage to selvage, which means the seam that is sewn, listen, that's straight a grain. If I had sewn it this way, it doesn't quite make that sound because this is going to stretch a little bit. Here's the crazy part about triangles. This is bias. Look at how much that stretches. So this at least alleviates one bit of bias by sewing along your straight a grain. That being said, before I sewed these together, I sprayed and pressed it with flatter because I want there to be the least amount of stretch along this angle here as I can possibly get. So before I cut my strip sets, I sprayed all of them. I sprayed both sides with flatter and pressed them to dry it out. Okay, so that's my first tip. Anytime you're cutting triangles or angles in any way, flatter is your friend. Okay. Now, when you're pressing this, because your seam is straight a grain, you don't have to worry so much about pressing this one because this isn't really going to stretch. What is going to stretch is out here, these tiny little points. So to make that a little bit more easy to work with, I'm going to kind of finger press this open first. And I don't like to hard finger press because if you take your nail and drag it along this and you get to these points over here, you're going to distort those points. So I'm just going to take and kind of press with my fingers the very edges of these diamonds. Okay. Then I'm going to take this over to my iron. Need to move the laptop. I'm going to take this over to my iron, and I'm going to spray it again with flatter. Thank you. Because I want those points to stay nice and sharp. I don't usually use steam when I'm using the flatter because I really want the flatter to be what dissipates through the fabric more than the water. Okay, so since I put the flatter on there, look at how straight the point is. It didn't distort at all. Yes, you have these crazy weird dog ears. We'll talk about those in a second. Okay. All right, so that is how you make the split diamond. Now we're going to talk about sewing to them. So when the pattern gives you the measurements of what to cut your strips to, it also gives you the measurements of what to cut these triangles to. You're going to cut, for this pattern, you're going to cut a large square and a small square. Okay, so we have cut a square and a square, and then we've cut them in half on the diagonal. The first element, you're going to use the small triangle on both the top and the bottom. Since we want to make this kind of fan, this is going to be your straight side. We're going to show you how to make this element because this element is slightly harder than this element. Another thing I strongly suggest when you're laying these out is to lay out your block before you start sewing it together, because you've got different angles. These are 90-degree angles. These are 45-degree angles. These are 120-degree angles. Okay. If you're not sure what the angle is, remember that all your angles are going to add up to 360. So if this is 45 and this is 45, that's 90. So if you divide that out, that's how you know what these angles are. Okay. So we've got the diamond here, the shape that I want to make. So if I put this on here, and then I put this on here, what's going to happen is that now I'm going to have a straight side here and a straight side here. It's going to look like this when it's done. Now, if you're not entirely sure and you're like, well, I'm going to take this over here and I'm going to sew this on here because that's the same length. And then I'm going to put this on here. That's not the same shape. Because that's how angles work. You just keep adding them together until they make a square. Sometimes your square is really funky. This angle is not going to make you happy to sew together. We don't like Y seams. So lay this out before you start sewing it is my biggest tip. Okay. This is the shape we want. Now, I don't cut my dog ears off until I'm done making the block. Because a couple of reasons, if I sew this on backward and then I have to take it off and I've trimmed this down, it's going to be harder to line things up. Okay. When I put this on here, there's a couple of things when you start to put angles together. Most of the time, when things are going together the right way, you're going to have straight points to match up somewhere. If I match up the straight side of this triangle with the straight side of this triangle, and I completely ignore what's happening here, and I sew my seam, it's all going to be straight. If I try to match up this point up here, it's sometimes I think when you're learning how to quilt, you think if it's easy, it must be wrong. Most of the time, the easiest direction is the right answer. Okay, so in this case, we're going to line up our triangle onto our diamond. I usually put just a couple of pins just because I'm going to move this over to my machine. Okay, and we're going to sew this seam. We're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I love my 1/4 inch piecing foot when I'm doing this kind of work. Okay, so we're going to take this to the machine. I've already got my 1/4 inch foot on here. Another little hot tip, lining up angles can be really a pain in the butt because this does not look like a 1/4 inch. This part of this angle that's hanging over gets really confusing because it doesn't look like a 1/4 inch, and quilters see everything in a 1/4 inch. But if you lay this all together and you put it under your 1/4 inch foot and you drop your foot should line up right there in that crack between the two pieces of fabric. so we're going to sew our 1/4 inch seam. And we're going to take this to the iron and we're going to see if we did it right. When I press this out, I should have a pretty straight angle. And I do. But I have a dog ear here and I have a dog ear here. We're going to leave those for now because next we're going to take, you can stay there. We're going to take this angle that we laid out and we're going to sew this one to here. Again, we've got a straight 90-degree angle that we can match up. So we can match this part of our angle and this part of our angle. So we have, anytime you can match a 90-degree, it's probably the right thing. Okay, so we're going to pin these two, and I'm going to sew a seam here. Now ideally, same thing, when you get to the point, it should come into that crack right there between the two pieces of fabric. Don't worry if it's not perfect. Remember, you're going to take up some space when you press it. Now let's test and see if we did that right. All right. I left my dog ears on, and I'm going to trim them off in a second, and I'm going to show you some tricks. Now look at how nice and straight this is. We have a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance from here to here so that when we go and sew these pieces together, we're not going to clip off our point. Okay, look at that. All right, so a couple of tips when you're going to trim your points off. And I have this one like this on purpose so I can show you. This is not the proper ruler to do this with, but I don't want to go get another one. You can either line up a ruler along your straight part and take the ends off, or you can just snip it with scissors. If you have something like this, where this is off just about a 1/16 of an inch, let me show you how to straighten that out. So if you line up your block, and you line up the diamond here, and you line up the top of the point here, you'll notice that almost always it's just a little section right here that gets a little wonky. That's because of bias. Bias is a pain in the butt. I'm just going to trim this little piece off right here. I'm not going to trim it all the way up. We're just going to trim off the part that wasn't quite straight. Okay? Again, I'm going to leave this dog ear on until I'm not sewing anything to it anymore. And when I line these points up, again, all we have to do is take off that tiny little dog ear. Okay? So now what we've done is we've got this element that we can now sew onto this piece. Oops, wrong way. This way. So when we put this onto here, these two triangles make a square, and then this makes our zigzag. Okay? I think that's cool. That is how you work these diamonds to make these shapes to then sew them to each other. I wanted you to get a picture of how this lays out before we went to the Quilt-as-you-go, because the way you do the Quilt-as-you-go is a little bit upside down and backward, and I didn't want to make you crazy. First thing I want to talk about is some tips about Quilt-as-you-go. The pattern for this one suggests that you use clover clips to hold this together. I have rarely had good success with Quilt-as-you-go using clover clips. What I prefer is 505 spray. I talk about 505 spray to people a lot. You should use 505 spray like hairspray. Not 80s hairspray, minimal hairspray. So think a light mist after your hair has been done. We're not like, you know, ratting it and teasing it and then busting out the blow dryer. This is not 1984, okay? We're going to take the 505 spray and we're going to very lightly spray based. Here's a couple of tips for working with terry cloth. So the quilted bath mat that we're making has terry cloth on the back. This is a thin, lightweight terry cloth. This is a bit of cotton batting. I'm going to roll my section back a little bit. The pattern calls for a specific size of backing, or a specific size of terry cloth and batting. I would suggest cutting it about 2 inches bigger, 2 inches bigger. So let's say it's 20, cut it 24. If it's 30 wide, cut it 34. Just give yourself a little bit of leeway. One, terry rolls just a little bit. I'm going to show you how to fix that. So if you take your 505 spray, and normally I would not do this on my cutting mat, I would probably do it outside, or I like to take a cardboard box and lay it in the cardboard box, so then if there's overspray, it doesn't really matter. But you're just going to very lightly mist this. And then I'm going to take half of my batting and I'm going to smooth it. And then I'm going to take the other side. Going to very lightly spray the terry cloth, and then I'm going to smooth the batting. You do not need to glue this forever. It just needs to hold this down so that you can get to your sewing machine. Now, once you get that glue down, flip it over. Make sure you don't have any puckers anywhere. Let's pretend that there's a pucker right here. I'm going to peel this back, smooth it from the pucker, and then smooth it back down. Okay, so it's tacky, sort of like a sticky note. The other thing that I want to do, let me find somewhere that it's doing it, of course, because I want you to see it. It's not going to do it. All right, normally terry cloth is going to roll under like that until you get to the edge. Okay, peel it back a little bit, spray just a little bit on the edge. And then if you take and roll this out, you will not have any rolls on the edge. It's going to stick down. Okay, you don't need to spray this to death. A couple of reasons why you don't want to spray this to death. If you put a whole bunch of this on here, it's going to flake off when you quilt. It's going to go down into your bobbin case, and then you're going to have to clean your bobbin case more. Okay, use just little bits of this. All right, so that is how I would baste this. So what we have is batting, terry cloth. Then we can take our shape, except I take this back. The directions have you, here, I'm just going to cut one. I'll pretend that we're going to use this one. We're going to take our first shape. So this is the shape that we're going to make, basically. We're going to take our first shape. I'm going to find the center of my bath mat. You can finger press it, or you can put a pin in there. It doesn't have to be exact because you're going to trim this down after. You take the point of your diamond and you line that up with the fold. You also want to make sure that the bottom of your diamond is not right on the edge, because you're going to want to trim this, and you're going to add a batting or a binding. Okay, so this is the first place we're going to start. I would also, only on this piece, put 505 spray on the back of this, especially the points. Because these points are so extreme, you want them to lay flat. Okay, so I have most of that done here. Here's my bath mat. Okay, so here is that first one that I laid down. See how it lines up with the edge, and I've got a chunk left over so I can trim this down. This is Quilt-as-you-go. So what I did was I put this piece down. I sewed this piece through all of the layers, flipped it out, pressed it. Again, the pattern tells you to finger press. There's not that many pieces to this. I encourage you to iron press between each one. Because this is why I wanted you to see how the diamond goes together the first, before we did this, because when you lay these out and flip them over, it gets a little weird. Okay, so I have done all of these pieces first. The rest of the mat you're going to angle out, and you're going to finish it off a little bit differently. So what I have left to put on, I lost my piece. Oh, here it is. No. What I have left to put on is these two pieces. Okay. Because of the way that this goes together, some of your pieces you need to sew this piece on first. You can't just put the diamonds together, because, oh no, did I put that on the wrong side? I'll bet you money I did. flip it. I can't flip it. See, this is why I did it ahead of time. Oh no, I didn't screw it up. Look at me, I didn't screw it up, everybody. Okay, it's gonna hang like that. This one is then going to make the diamond like that. So I've already sewn this to this. We're gonna go ahead and do the last 3 pieces so you can see how this works. I'm gonna press this. See how this is curling a little bit? I would add more flatter to that. So I'm just gonna press this out, and then we're gonna show some tips for Quilt-as-you-go. Here's another tip when you're putting angles together. Remember I said if you can line up a 90-degree angle, it's probably the right way. This is just lined up to the point here. And we're gonna press this out. I'm also gonna add just a touch of flatter to this because it's rolling up to make that not be a thing. Okay? Anytime you're working with shot cottons, flatter is your best friend. Okay, so we have this element. We're going to sew this onto our bath mat. I wanted to get to this point because I can show you more tips for how to make everything line up correctly. Angles make people a little bit crazy, and I respect that. I'm going to snip that little piece off because we're sewing it to the next section. I want to match up this seam, so I'm going to match those 2 points. See if you can get down to that. See how that seam is there, and here is this seam. I'm going to match those 2 points of the yellow fabric. I'm going to pin through all the layers because I don't want it to move. I'm going to pin that point there as well. And I'm going to pin it down here just because I want to make sure it doesn't wiggle. And I know this looks weird, but it'll all work out in the end, I promise. All right, now we're going to talk tips for Quilt-as-you-go. Most sewing machines now come with a walking foot. This machine happens to have the big Mac Daddy of a walking foot. So to put your walking foot on, you need to take your foot off. That means you also need to take off your ankle. If this is your foot, your ankle attaches your foot to your body. Okay, so this is the part that comes off. Go ahead and unscrew that. My walking foot is humongous. I call it a tank foot because it has a continuous feed belt on it. It's cool. You don't have to, super crank it. I usually just finger tighten my screw there. Mine actually plugs in, yours might not. However you get to a 1/4 inch sequence with your walking foot, that's how you want to be. If you cannot gauge a 1/4 inch with your walking foot, this happens to have reference lines on it, but if yours doesn't or you can't gauge a 1/4 inch, go ahead and mark a line. It'll make your life easier. So this foot, I know that I'm going to line up that red line there with the edge of my piece because that's where my 1/4 inch is. I've also made my stitch length a little bit longer. When you're sewing through all of these layers, especially if you don't have great traction with your machine, do yourself a favor and make a slightly longer stitch. It will move easier through through the machine. I'm just going to sew. I'm going to try to sew if my needle is threaded. I got my fingers in the way. All right, let's try again. We're just going to sew this seam. Since I'm using a longer seam allowance or stitch length, it's going to go through this pretty quickly. If you have a walking foot, your walking foot is going to be louder than without it because it's going to kind of hop as it moves. The idea of a walking foot is that the top layer of fabric moves at the same pace as the bottom layer of fabric. I want to show you something that just happened. See how my seam is coming right out in that crack right there? That is exactly what you want to happen. You know you lined everything up if your stitching is coming out through there. Here's another secret though. If it's not exact, don't freak out. With Quilt-as-you-go, you have to give yourself a little bit of leeway. All right, now, again, the pattern says you can finger press. With all of these layers happening here, I'm a much bigger fan of simply just pressing it. So, I'm going to just press this out. Now, a couple things are happening here. One, we have a nice little pleasing V that happens right here. That's a good sign. And this lines up down here. So when I take all that mess away, because that's going to get trimmed, that is exactly what we want that to look like. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add our last angle here. So since this is the other side of our split diamond, we're just going to line up our seam. I'm going to give you one more tip for when you're sewing angles together, especially when you're sewing angles together where your seam allowance is not clearly visible. Here's my hot tip for this. Just turn this way. I'm going to take my angle and a ruler that I can easily recognize a 1/4 inch on. Okay, I'm going to lay my ruler on my piece, whatever piece is going to be my next seam. And being that these angles are a little wonky because, you know, they're such an extreme angle, don't try to line the whole thing up. We're going to line up our 1/4 inch from the end here. The parts that you really care about are the ends. And I like this friction highlighter for this because it makes a really bright line. I'm going to mark both ends with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Is this extra work? Yes. Is it going to line up better? Okay, this is going to give you a couple of reference points. You don't have to mark the whole thing if you don't want to. But if you don't have a way of getting a 1/4 inch seam allowance with your walking foot, this will help you as well. So I'm going to take this split diamond, the other half of my diamond here, and I'm going to lay it on top of this diamond. I want to make sure that this is the shape that I want, and it is. Then I'm going to flip her over. By marking those lines down here, it gives your eye a place to look of where your stitching should end. So see where this is landing? You know, it's pretty close. But if I bring it up to this end and I don't really have a point of reference, if I line up the edges of my fabric like this, and then I can see that this is where my stitching should start, it gives you something, it gives you a jumping off point. It takes away the guesswork of where my angle is. Okay, so I'm going to pin that right there. And then I'm going to come down to the other end and I'm going to look and see where this is ending. And look, it's ending right there in that crack too. So, and yes, it's a little bit extra work, but you don't have that many pieces in this. It's not that big a deal to mark them. And it decreases the chances of being friendly with your seam ripper. All right, so now we're going to sew this one and see if it worked. Since it's a friction pin and you're marking on the back side of your fabric, it's going to come away when you press it anyway. Oh man, lugging this thing around is painful. Okay, we're going to line this up. Our walking foot's going to do the work for us. And things will shift a little bit sometimes, especially when you're doing quilt-as-you-go. So if as you sew this down, you see that the fabric starts to kind of creep on you a little bit, when you get down to the bottom, take the pin out so that you can adjust where this fabric's landing. It's better to be in control than to be really attached to your pinning. Okay? So if it starts to creep on you, you're the boss. Okay? Now, let's see if it worked. I have faith. So then when I press this, those marks are going to go away because it's a friction pen. And when I press this out, our pretty diamond. Okay, so the only thing that's left to do from this point is to add this last triangle on the end, which I'm not going to bore you with. This triangle here is going to finish your seam. This is another time where I would mark that 1/4 inch seam allowance because then you can line up exactly where this and this should end. Okay, so to finish this project, I'm going to sew this seam. That's going to give me this shape. Okay, so you can see where my bath mat is starting. Then I'm going to take this fabric here and I'm going to add, the pattern shows you exactly, you know, how wide it needs to be. We're going to add strips to the sides and we're going to trim them down, and we're going to add a strip here and here and here. And then that's going to make a bath mat that is yay big. Okay, this is a really fun thing to do, especially if you've used quilting fabric to make your shower curtain. 108-inch wide fabric is just the right size to make a shower curtain with. So we might talk about that at some point too. But look how cute this is. And it's already quilted. Here's your quilting lines on the back. If you want to add more quilting, knock yourself out. Since this is a bath mat and I'm probably going to wash it a bunch, when I'm done with this, I'm just going to take my binding. I'm going to sew the binding on the front by machine. I'm going to flip it and I'm going to sew it on the back by machine too, because I want it to be pretty sturdy. Okay? All right. If anybody has questions, speak up, because I don't think I saw any. Okay, so who is inclined to attempt now a 45-degree angle? And there are lots of fun things that you can do with that 45-degree angle. So like if you have this shape and you use the diamond side of it, let's just pretend that this was half, you have this really cool 45-degree triangle too. There's lots of things you can do with this ruler. One of my other favorite things to do is this 45-degree sort of harlequin diamond is a pain in the booty. But if you use this ruler, it makes it a whole lot easier. Okay? Mary, yes, I can ship flatter. In fact, it's going to be one of the things on today's sale. Okay? So here we go. These are the things that we talked about. Trisha, are you talking about the 120 ruler or the 45 ruler? Or are you talking about the angle of the diamond? So you can get a 120-degree ruler that is just this half of it. It's taller. So if you use a 140 or a 120-degree ruler that Creative Grids makes as well, it's really great for making large diamonds, because I want to say it's 6 or 8 inches tall, so you have more options for what size of a 120 you can do. But this gives you the option of doing a 45-degree diamond, a 45-degree triangle, as well as 120-degree angles. So it gives you lots of other options. And the other thing is too, when you use this side of the ruler, you can make the setting angles. So for instance, if you were going to make like a harlequin diamond, you can use this to set it. You can do this, Brooke. This is fun, because look at how cool this is. And like I just showed you, where you make setting bits with the cut in half, there's no Y seams. I will do everything in my power to not make a Y seam, like full stop. Okay? All right, so we're going to talk about what we used on the video today. The first thing we talked about, and the first thing we used, obviously, is this Big Mag Daddy 45-degree diamond ruler. Do you dig this? It's a whole lot of fun. So number 100 is this ruler. She is a big ruler. We will do our best to ship her completely flat. Of course, you could always order a bunch of fabric and then we can pad it with that. So number 100 is the ruler itself. Number 101 is the 505 spray. A couple of things about 505 spray. Great for basting quilts. Great for, I want to temporarily stick this to something else. So if you want to put a patch on a jacket, you just want to sew it on and you don't want to fuse it, spray some of this on there, stick it down there, sew around it, because it washes out. So this is temporary adhesive in that it washes out. It will hold it for a while. It'll actually hold it for quite some time. Let's see, what else? Do not use this in your rotary hoop. Your machine tech will yell at you for getting it all up in the bobbin case. It's bad for the hoops. We have lots of other options for that. But I use this for all kinds of times when I just want to stick something to something and then I want to sew on it. Okay, but this is temporary, so it's only meant to hold temporarily until you do the next thing that's going to make it stick down. Okay, so that's 505 spray. Then we talked about flatter. Incidentally, right before this video, because this blouse is like, I don't know, polyester or something, I had the worst static in my shirt. And so I handed my bottle of flatter to DJ and I was like, here, spray me down with this. Look, no static. Just saying, this has more use. I like flavor, the fig scent the best. My second favorite scent is called Lacy. I like things that smell more woodsy typically, but I try to switch up the smells that we're using on different videos because, you know. So today we're talking about the Uzu smell. This one smells like if oranges were perfume. That's the best way to describe this. It smells sort of like an orange creamsicle. So Uzu is also a really great smell. I like flatter for all kinds of things. I like to prep my fabric with it. I like it better than Best Press for a lot of reasons. One, it's natural scents. So I'm really sensitive to chemical smells. Perfume gives me a headache. I don't like the smells that are in laundry detergent, that kind of stuff. This doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I like the way it smells. Because it's plant-based, it doesn't give me a headache from smelling it. Also, since it's plant-based, don't dilute this. There's no preservatives in it that will stop mold from growing, so don't be tempted to throw water in here so it'll last longer. If you want to make it last longer, you want to cut back the smell, mix it with scentless. And I do have it in scent-free. But this is the Uzu smell. I really like that. Heather, you're right. You're absolutely right. Your math brain is right. I was wrong. Yeah, Heather pointed out that it's not a 120 angle, it's a 135 angle because that's why this one is super long and flat. The 120 angle is just a little bit tighter. And the 120 angle, I believe, is the other end of the 60. So the 60-degree angle here gives you a 120-degree angle here, since this is a 45-degree angle, and 90, 135 would be 170. Yes. I need a nap. Let's see. The next thing we talked about was the friction highlighter. This comes in a bunch of different colors. We've got yellow and blue and green and orange, I think. Since pink was the one I demoed, pink is the one that's on the video. I like my friction pen for my friction highlighter for a couple of things. When I'm marking things like this where I really want to see it, I use the highlighter. I also like the highlighter when I'm working on a pattern that I know I want to use again. So if I'm using a pattern in a book, say, and I want to make myself notes, or I want to cross off the things that I've already done, I will mark on it with this, because then when I'm done doing whatever the project is, I just run a dry iron over my pattern and all my notes go away. And so then when I want to make the quilt again, I make new notes. So I like to write down what fabric goes. I very rarely use the fabric that's in the picture. So if I'm making a blue quilt but my quilt is orange and green and turquoise, I will write notes on what color the fabric I'm actually going to use. So if you make notes with a friction pen, run it across your pattern with an iron at the end, you can start over and make it again. All right. The next thing, normally we don't put fabric on our sales because we sell our fabric in quarter yard increments. We are working on changing our fabric to being sold for full yard increments. For the sake of today's video only, I have changed it so that you can buy 1 yard at a time of the terry cloth. Because this is a fun project, I have 2 types of terry cloth. This is the finer sort of baby weight terry. If you look close at it, I don't know if I can get close enough to really see that it's a very fine loop, thinner. So it's great for making baby hoodies and stuff, but it is terry cloth, so it is absorbent. So the pink one is the light terry. That is for 1 full yard. The next thing, the other terry that I have is this white terry cloth, which is at least twice as thick. That's the reason for the price difference. So when you get up close to this, see how the loops are a lot thicker, because this is a thicker terry cloth. If I want to make a bath mat, I would probably use this one just because it's got a little more cush to it. But it's white, so if you don't do the white thing, I'd rather have something that doesn't show dirt as much, and the pink might be better. I'm having a really hard time getting my hands on terry cloth right now, which is why I only have the 2 colors. We'll try to add some more later. So that one's number 105 is the white terry cloth. Then we have the 2 patterns that we talked about. Number 106 is the split diamond table topper. That was this here. So you can either make it as a table topper, you can sew all of these rows together like I was showing you where they kind of crisscross over to each other, or I could have flipped that the other way and finished this out here and it would have made a placemat. So you can make 2 placemats or 1 table runner with this, with the measurements that are on this pattern. The tools that it calls for is the ruler. So the ruler is the 45-degree ruler. It was number 100. And then starch and some marking tools and things like that. So you need a background fabric, and honestly, if you have some laying around strips that are salvage to salvage that are at least 6 inches wide, you could make that with this. And then the last pattern is number 107. This is the bath mat. The bath mat pattern gives you the steps for the Quilt-as-you-go as well. However, if you have never laid these out, then the Quilt-as-you-go is a little upside down and backward. So if you like the shape of this, these patterns are only like $4. I would get both of them because they give you the idea of how to do both. Okay. Sharon, the number for the ruler is number 100. If you want to buy it on here. You can also pick up any of these things on our website. You know, if you want a different color friction pen, or you want a different color, a different smell of flatter, you can order all this stuff on the website too. Or if you want to order it on the sale and add things from the website, like maybe you want to add fabric to make your bath mat, I will combine shipping. We'll put it all together in one. Okay. So I hope I have demystified a little bit the 45-degree diamond. They look really cool. And once you get you get some tips and you're not quite as afraid of the angles, they go together pretty easy. I mean, look at how pleasing all of those seams are. Okay, so go forth and quilt the bath mat. We will see you on Wednesday. Wednesday is a skinny bolt sale. So we will see you Wednesday at 4:30. Again, our Wednesday sales are also going to change to later in the evening, but not this week. It'll be next week. Frogger's over here fluffing his bed. We will see you then. Have a nice night.